So I recently made up my mind that I want to talk mostly about a couple of subjects because they're pretty relevant to what's going on nowadays. And, I want to give value every chance I get. So I'm against just putting out content for the sake of content, but I feel like this subject needs to be talked about a lot. So, I find myself sitting around thinking about how to come up with analogies and different modes of explanation to help people understand this, because everybody learns different, right? I've just noticed in years of teaching people ideas that certain people just respond a certain way to an input or an idea or a concept, and you gotta work with them a little bit. Sometimes your first explanation isn't the one that hooks them, gets their attention. And so my point is, I spend a lot of time thinking about it and not executing on it because I'm trying to be a perfectionist, I guess, because I really want to get through to people with this. It's a tough one. It was very hard for me to learn this. I'm a guy who likes things I can touch. That's why I'm a gold and silver guy. I like things I can hold in my hand and count. They make sense to me. Concepts and ideas I like, no problem, but concepts and ideas sometimes are tough to get across. And if you can use a visual model or something like that, that's even better. But setting up those kind of videos for you folks requires a lot of work, and I'm going to do some of these things. Stay tuned. I'm going to put a few videos out once I get these ideas kind of healed and get them ready. But I feel like I need to give some context on an ongoing basis, and I'm hoping maybe some of these ideas will land on you folks and make a lot of sense. So without further defending my position, why I'm doing what I'm doing here, let's get down to it. So the concept of value and that word. So I'm going to repeat it again. I'm going to talk about the word value, like I said, I'm a words definitions guy. I like a clear definition so we know what we're talking about. So what does the word value mean again, folks? Well, in context of finance, it means the same thing as the word worth does. It's two words we hear a lot. Well, what's that worth? Or what's the value of that? Right? So on that note, value and worth both mean the same thing in essence. They mean equal to. Proof is, I ask the question, what's your house worth? The guy gives me a number, $500,000. In other words, what you're saying is your house is equal to $500,000. Correct. So it proves that it means equal to. There's an example. And if I wrote that down and put it for you visually, it'd be even more obvious. So worth and value mean equal to for all intent and purpose in the context of finance. All right? So what is the value of something? Well, here's the thing. I also say all values are relative, meaning it's very difficult to understand if something is overpriced or underpriced or overvalued, undervalued, without comparing it to something else, because we need a benchmark, we need a standard. If all values are relative, that means there's a float somewhere, something that the value of an individual thing is floating up and down within a range. And it's hard to know whether it's undervalued or overvalued unless we compare it to something else. But now we have a dilemma. We have a secondary dilemma, and the dilemma is the thing we're comparing it to overvalued or undervalued? And if you assume wrong, of course you're going to get the wrong answer. So this is a tricky thing to understand value, being that all values are relative and value means equal to. Equal to what, right? So if we're going to use the benchmark of dollars or credit units to measure value in the moment, then we're going to have to compare, and then we're going to have to find out if the thing we're comparing to is a proper benchmark. So how do we get a benchmark? Well, on the piano we use middle C, but if middle C isn't tuned to the right frequency, then it's an improper benchmark. So you have, again, relative tuning, right? So what do we need to compare C to? Well, it has to be a frequency, which is an established benchmark. It's something that frequency doesn't change. Well, in the same sense with value, it's almost like we have to go back to the base. And what is the base of value? Well, the base of value is, in my opinion, labor, or anything that looks like labor. When we think of labor, don't think of a guy shoveling. I know that's a visual that always goes through my mind when I think of labor. Somebody shoveling. I don't know why. It's just a meme I've got stuck in there. But there can be other modes of work, thinking, talking. I'm working right now, driving. Cab drivers drive, right? Accountants count. That's work. So any kind of work or labor has value, because we wouldn't have any of the stuff that you're seeing go back, the infrastructure that's blasting back and forth behind me, like that bridge that just went by, and the road behind me and all the other, nothing would exist without labor. If we don't get off our butts and get out there and make stuff, then we don't have anything and we don't have any real value. Yeah, sure, there's values that exist outside of that, but that's a different topic. We're talking about, substance within the context of finance. So how do we get a benchmark? Well, okay, that's a different discussion. Let me see if I can come up with something that makes sense. What does a benchmark look like and why? Okay, so to me, a good benchmark would be something that is universal, that a lot of people use, right? Why? Because in order to get a valuation that is a sort of a standard, because look, most values move in a range, and that's got to do with supply and demand. When we're talking just price, like dollar values, let's be correct here and say most dollar values move within a range. Again, correct language, right? I got to police myself if I'm going to police everybody else on language. So really what we're talking about is dollar value. So dollar value of a given commodity or a given product or service will move within a range up and down depending on supply and demand. As there becomes less of something, businesses will tend to recognize that in the market, and they will either take up a position selling that product or selling that service, and then create a more of a surplus, and that'll ride into a cycle and ride up, and the price will generally tend to go down as the market responds to the lack of supply. And then of course that will go through a trend and a phase, and the supply will rise up, and it will get to a peak where, hey, wait a minute, our competitors are cutting our prices here, and everybody's jockeying for a position to get more customers, and prices are dropping. So this is what happens. It's an ebb and flow effect. But the more times that a product and service is bought and sold, it tends to control that range much tighter, because people generally see the movement of the price and react to or against it more often, tends to keep the averages lower. So something that's bought and sold a lot, like a commodity that everybody uses, like wheat and flour, often make better benchmarks than things that are sold infrequently, or something that's in a bit of a fluctuation in terms of dollar value. For example, big screen TVs that make a lousy benchmark, because not that they're not sold a lot and not that they're universal, but they're going down in dollar value because innovation is making them cheaper and cheaper to produce. So they make a lousy benchmark. If you're going to use big screen TVs as a benchmark, you're going to be way off base, I think. So you'd be better off to use something that's used a lot, like oil or copper. Copper is ubiquitous in the world. It's used everywhere. It's traded a lot. So if we are looking for a benchmark to establish value so that we can compare values, dollar values, between various different items, then copper would be a good benchmark. Oftentimes when people use the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the index, or the S&P index. And that's another thing. What's an index? So now that I brought that up, and I'm always complaining that people gloss over things and don't explain it, what is an index? Well, I'm going to do a separate video where I kind of break down indices in a simple way so that people understand the nuts and bolts of that. But an index is basically, well, with the Dow 30, it's the top 30 corporations. We take their stock average, so you divide each of the stock's values by 30 and get a number. That's the Dow index, all right? So it takes an average across the board. So that's a relatively stable thing, because not only are you taking one company that's traded frequently and taking its average, but you're taking 30 of the top countries and taking a further average of those 30, giving a very, very tight benchmark position that you can use as a benchmark stable. The same way that surveyors have benchmarks on land, because that's at ground level, stable. We need a benchmark to measure where we are. So something like the Dow or the S&P with all those data points and taking averages of that is a very stable position, dollar-wise, to benchmark against. So many times people will, for example, trying to look at the true value of gold, for example, or silver, will benchmark it to the Dow, for example, say, well, how many ounces of gold does it take to buy the Dow currently? And then you get a number. Now, if you track that number again weekly or daily, or you'll get an average, which creates a curve on a graph. And so that's a good benchmark, something that's stable like that. It's traded in a lot and has a very stable data point. So this is an exercise that really smart money managers often go through in order to come to conclusions about where we're at. So an example of that was recently I heard a discussion come up. They were talking about the price of gold, and it had hit 2,000 before. So we're assuming that gold's going to break 2,000 in the near future again, 2,000 US. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that it's the same value, right? Not price, but value, as it was the last time gold broke that price? Well, now what would you do? Based on what I just said, how would you determine that? Give you a little bit of time to think. Just think. How would you determine that? All right, what if we use the Dow? What if we said, hey, let's compare how many ounces of gold it took to buy the Dow back then. Now, granted, the Dow was a different number back then, but remember, it's a stable number at the time, right? So what if we took the Dow back then and said, what's the ratio? How many ounces of gold to buy the Dow whatever number of years ago, and then, or back when it was $2,000 an ounce, right? We're trying to compare things equal apples to apples here. So at the point that gold crosses 2,000 an ounce in the near future, this is an exercise that you folks could take upon yourself. So while we're at it, I'm going to do it. Why don't you do it too? Make this an exercise for yourself, those that are witnessing this right now, before that eventuality comes. So when gold makes that cross at 2,000, look at the Dow and say, okay, so if gold is 2,000, what's the Dow? Let's say it's 34,000. So that's a 17-to-1 ratio. So go back to the Dow in, say, the last time gold hit 2,000 back, I think it was in the 80s. I'm not sure, maybe it was recently. I'm going to have to look at that. I should know that answer. Anyway, go back to the last time it hit 2,000, look at the price of the Dow, and compare that ratio. So if the Dow was 8,000 at a time, now you only have a 4-to-1 ratio. So which one has the most value? Well, obviously, if $2,000 gold happens in the near future here soon, and you have a 17-to-1 ratio, obviously it's undervalued because the ratio is higher. Gold is much lower in ratio, takes 17 ounces, so gold is less valuable. So this is how we get tricked by the number. You say, well, gold's at 2,000, I'm doing great. When I bought gold at 2,000 back at, that time, now I'm par, I can go and get my value back. Can you? Right? Because now you can't take that gold and trade it for as many multiples of or shares of the Dow. So in that regard, you're undervalued. So these are the exercises we actually have to go through. And this is something that is so counterintuitive to most of our thinking, because we like shortcuts. I get it. I like shortcuts. I like to just compare price and go, hey, looks good. I bought the car for X, and now I'm selling it for X, and I'm good. It's a good price. Is it? Again, because after you've received the dollars, well, we don't want these dollars. What good are the dollars for us? I can't eat them. I need to trade them for another car. Can I get as much car as I got before with that? Right? That's the question. How do you measure that? Again, we need a benchmark and we need a comparative standard. So I'm going to leave it at that. That's a pretty long video talking around in circles about concepts. We're going to get some of these in models and put them down in visual and paper models where you can compare and see these things for what they are. And hopefully that'll very in good stead going forward. Stop thinking about price and getting hung up on price. You'll always be a victim if you think about price. If you only think about price, you'll always be a victim. Just remember that. All right? That's enough for a video, I think, for that subject. Have a great day. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. See you later, folks. Thanks for listening.